I need to tell you something about my regiment before they promote me again. Before the Departamento Munitorum stamps another commendation onto my record and sends me back to train the next generation of Catachan recruits. I need someone to understand why I requested this transfer to the Administratum Archives. Why I spend my nights in the climate-controlled sanctity of paperwork instead of in the barracks with my brothers. Why I can't stand the smell of certain plants anymore. Or why I wake up tasting copper and lime. They call us the finest jungle fighters in the Imperium. They say no regiment can match us in close-quarters combat, that we're born with knives in our hands and venom in our veins. The recruitment posters show us standing proud, our bandanas bright against the green hell of our homeworld, our muscles carved from years of surviving what Catachan throws at children before they earn the right to be called adults. What they don't show, what they can't show, is what comes after. What happens when you've spent not just your childhood but your adult life learning that everything around you is trying to kill you, and that the only way to survive is to be more lethal than anything else in the undergrowth. The Xenos tactical briefing I attended 15 years ago is what started me thinking about it properly. I was young then, only 3 campaigns off Catachan, still proud of my regimental patch and the reputation that preceded us wherever we deployed. The briefing was on Ork psychology, delivered by some Ordo Xenos attaché who'd never fired a lasgun in anger but had read every treatise on greenskin behavior ever filed with the Inquisition. He stood before the hololith display showing Ork tribal structures, explained their love of combat, their biological drive toward warfare, their complete absence of fear in any conventional sense. Orks, he said, will fight anything. They seek out the biggest, most dangerous opponents, because combat is their species' fundamental purpose. They charge space marine positions with nothing but crude choppers. They ram Imperial Navy vessels with ships held together by scrap and belief. They throw themselves at tyrannid swarms for the joy of a good scrap. But, the attaché said, and here he paused in a way that made me pay attention, there are documented cases of Ork Warbosses specifically avoiding prolonged engagements with Catachan regiments. Not retreating, you understand. Orks don't retreat, but redirecting their wargs, choosing alternative strategic objectives, sometimes even withdrawing from planets when they learn Catachans have been deployed in force. I remember laughing. We all did. The idea that greenskins, who would fight their own shadows if they got bored enough, would avoid us, seemed like the highest possible compliment, proof of our effectiveness. Validation of everything Catachan had made us into. The attaché didn't laugh. He just looked at us with something I didn't recognize at the time. Something I understand now was not respect or admiration but a kind of clinical unease, like a medicae studying a particularly virulent disease culture. Then he moved on to standard engagement protocols, and I forgot about it, filed it away under the general category of things that make the Imperium's enemies fear the Emperor's wrath. I forgot about it until Goral IV, 3 years later. That was the first time I started to smell what I'm going to try to describe to you now. Goral IV was a jungle world, not death world classification but close enough. 87% humidity at all times, canopy so thick you could go weeks without seeing the sky, and vegetation that grew fast enough you could watch it reclaim cleared landing zones within hours. The Orks had been there for perhaps 6 months before we arrived, long enough to establish a substantial presence, but not long enough to completely strip the biomass for their war machines. Command estimated 2, maybe 3 wargs, converging on the primary hive city, which meant we were looking at tens of thousands of greenskins at minimum. Our regiment, the Catachan III, was tasked with harassment operations in the deep jungle, disrupting supply lines and eliminating isolated mobs before they could reinforce the main assault. Standard work for us, the kind of warfare we'd been shaped for since before we could walk. The transport drop went smoothly, our shuttles skimming the canopy and depositing us in a clearing that would be gone within the week. We moved into the undergrowth like water soaking into fabric, silent and inevitable, and within an hour it was like we'd never landed at all. The jungle smelled right. That's the first thing I noticed, and at the time it felt like coming home. Catachan has a smell that gets into your bones, a mixture of rot and growth happening simultaneously. The constant process of life, consuming death, consuming life in an endless cycle that has no room for sentiment or mercy. Goral IV smelled similar, though less concentrated. The chemical signature slightly different, but close enough that my body responded with a loosening of muscles I hadn't realized were tensed. My squad moved through the undergrowth with the ease of practice, reading the signs of orc passage in bent branches and torn leaves, following trails that the greenskins thought were hidden, but were obvious to eyes trained on a world where invisibility meant survival. We found the first orc camp on the third day. 8 greenskins, small ones by their standards, gathered around a fire that was producing far too much smoke for proper fieldcraft. They had a roasted animal on a spit, something local they'd killed, and they were arguing about something in their guttural language, shoving each other with the casual violence of their kind. We watched them for 20 minutes from positions they would never spot, memorizing their patterns, identifying the leader by the way the others deferred to him. Then Sergeant Harkin gave the hand signal, and we moved. I need you to understand something about how Catachans fight. We don't announce ourselves. We don't give the enemy a chance to respond, or organize, or even understand what's happening. We appear from the undergrowth like we're part of it, like the jungle itself has decided to kill you, and by the time you realize you're under attack, it's already over. My knife went into the first orc's kidney region, whatever passed for kidneys in their crude biology, and I was moving to the second before the first even started to fall. The others were similarly efficient. 8 orcs dead in perhaps 15 seconds, their blood mixing with the muddy ground, their crude weapons never even drawn. But here's the thing. That's when I smelled it for the first time, really smelled it clearly enough to identify it. It was coming from us, from my squad, a particular scent that wasn't the usual smell of sweat and last charge residue. It was sharper than that, almost acidic, with an organic component that reminded me of the chemical secretions of Catachan's apex predators, the smell that Catachan devils release when they're hunting, that makes prey animals freeze even when they can't see the threat. I'd noticed it before, vaguely, but always assumed it was something environmental, something in the plant life or the water. But standing there in that orc camp, with my knife still dripping green blood, I realized it was coming from us, from me. Harkin noticed me sniffing the air and gave me a look that I interpreted as curiosity, though his face was hard to read under the camouflage paint and the scars. "You smell it too," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. I nodded, not sure what I was acknowledging. He smiled, showing teeth that were filed to points in the old Catachan tradition, a practice that was supposedly decorative, but that I was starting to suspect served a more practical purpose. "Good," he said. "Means you're adapting properly. Means the jungle recognizes its own." We continued deeper into the Goral IV interior, hitting orc positions every few days, leaving no survivors, taking trophies in the manner of our regiment. I'm not going to detail everything we took from the bodies. The Munitorum knows about the teeth, the crude jewelry, the occasional weapon, if it's well made enough. What they don't acknowledge officially is the rest of it, the ritual elements that aren't in any manual but that every Catachan learns from their squad sergeants, passed down through generations of jungle fighters who understood that there were things you needed to do to mark territory, to establish dominance, to make the enemy understand at a primal level that they had entered a space that belonged to something more dangerous than them. The smell got stronger the longer we stayed in the field. It was most pronounced when we were hunting, when we'd identified a target and were moving into position. My body would start producing it without conscious thought, sweat glands activating in a way that didn't happen in normal circumstances, something in my biochemistry responding to the proximity of prey. The others smelled the same way. We smelled the same way. When we moved through the jungle together, we left an invisible trail that I couldn't quite perceive myself, but that I knew was there. The same way you know a wound is infected even before you see the discoloration. On the 18th day, we found something that should have made me ask questions sooner. We'd been tracking a larger orc force, maybe 30 individuals, following them through a swamp region where the water came up to our waists and things brushed against your legs that you couldn't see and didn't want to identify. The orcs were moving toward a supply cache they'd established, unaware that we'd already visited it 3 days prior and left it very specifically intact, but modified in ways they wouldn't notice until it was too late. Standard Catachan tactics: poison the water source, weaken structural supports so they collapse under weight, contaminate ammunition stores with compounds that cause misfires, let the environment kill them, or at least soften them up before you move in personally. We were perhaps 100 meters behind the orc column when they stopped, just stopped, all at once, and I saw the leader raise his head and sniff the air in a gesture that was eerily familiar because I'd been doing the same thing for weeks. The orcs started vocalizing to each other, their language too crude for me to understand properly, but the tone was unmistakable. They were agitated, uncertain, and then, incredibly, they changed direction, abandoning their path toward the supply cache and moving instead toward a ridgeline that would take them out of the swamp and into more open terrain. They were avoiding us. Not running, nothing so undignified for an orc, but definitely choosing an alternative route, getting out of the enclosed space where we had the advantage. Hakan made a decision gesture and we pursued, but by the time we cleared the swamp, the orcs had put enough distance between us that an ambush was no longer feasible. We could have followed them, worn them down over days, but Command had tasked us with hitting lighter targets and we had a schedule to maintain. That night, as we made camp in a tree hollow that provided overhead cover, I asked Hakan about it, asked him directly why the orcs had changed course, whether he thought they'd detected us somehow. He was quiet for a long time, cleaning his knife with the methodical care that Catachans reserve for their most essential tools, and I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "They smelled us. Not smelled us like you smell smoke or lasgun discharge. Smelled what we are. What Catachan makes you become if you survive long enough." I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Just went back to his knife maintenance, and I knew enough about Catachan culture not to push. You earned information through survival and observation, not by asking questions that might reveal weakness or insufficient adaptation. So I filed it away with the other things I was starting to notice. The way my night vision had improved beyond what augmetics would provide, the way I could identify the species of an animal by the pattern of its movement through distant undergrowth, the way my hands had developed calluses in places that didn't correspond to normal weapon use, but rather to the specific angles of grappling and close quarters killing that we practiced until they were more instinctive than breathing. The campaign on Goral IV lasted 4 months. In that time our regiment killed an estimated 4,000 orcs through direct action, and perhaps twice that many through environmental manipulation, contamination, and what the after-action reports clinically described as indigenous wildlife agitation. The main warg never made it to the primary hive. It fragmented, broke apart into smaller groups that could be handled by conventional guard regiments, and eventually the greenskins were reduced to isolated mobs that posed no strategic threat. Command called it an overwhelming success. The Lord General personally commended our regiment, said we'd prevented what could have been a months-long siege with tens of thousands of Imperial casualties. What he didn't mention, what wasn't in any of the official reports, was that by the end of the campaign I couldn't stand to be around normal humans anymore. Their smell was wrong, too clean, too processed, lacking the chemical complexity that marked proper adaptation. When I was assigned to a joint briefing with Cadian officers, I had to consciously suppress the urge to evaluate them as prey, to identify the vulnerable points in their anatomy, to calculate the most efficient killing approaches. It wasn't a conscious thought process. It was something deeper, something that lived in the same part of my brain that controlled breathing and heartbeat, a predatory subroutine that Catachan had installed in my neurology before I was old enough to understand what was happening. They rotated us off-world after Goral IV, standard practice to prevent over-adaptation to a specific environment, but the smells came with us. On the transport ship I could identify each member of my squad by scent alone, even in complete darkness, could track their movement through corridors by following the trace chemical signatures they left in the recycled air. The ship's crew gave us space, more space than they gave other guard regiments, and I noticed they never turned their backs to us fully, always keeping us in their peripheral vision, the way you keep a dangerous animal in sight, even when it seems docile. Our next deployment was Catachan, a forge world with minimal organic presence, all metal and promethium, and the endless grinding of machines. It should have been a relief, a chance to reset in an environment that had nothing in common with jungle warfare. But within a week I was having dreams about undergrowth that couldn't possibly exist on Catachan, waking up with my hands positioned around an imaginary throat, my body coiled in a striking posture that I didn't remember assuming. The other Catachans were experiencing similar dissonance. We'd been shaped for one kind of warfare so thoroughly that other environments felt fundamentally wrong, like we were being forced to operate in a medium that couldn't support our particular form of life. The Orks on Catachan didn't know what to make of us. We were deployed for urban combat, moving through the industrial sectors to clear out greenskin infestations in the foundries and assembly halls. It should have been difficult for us, fighting in an environment that had none of the concealment or advantages we were trained for. But we adapted, because that's what Catachans do, what we're designed to do at a level more fundamental than conscious choice. We learned to read the industrial terrain the way we read jungle trails, to use shadows and machinery the way we used vegetation, to turn the Orks' own environment against them with the same ruthless efficiency we applied to organic ecosystems. And the smell came with us. In the recycled air of the forge world it was more concentrated, had nowhere to dissipate, and I started to understand that it wasn't just a byproduct of our biology but something we could control, something we were producing intentionally on some level. When we were hunting, moving toward an Ork position, I could feel my body shift into a different state, endocrine system flooding my bloodstream with compounds that I couldn't name but that I knew were changing the way I processed information, the way I moved, the way I evaluated threats and opportunities. It was like having a secondary nervous system that activated under specific circumstances, one that was older than human civilization, that connected to parts of the brain that predated language and tool use. The Orks started avoiding certain sectors of the forge world, areas where we'd been operating, even though those sectors had strategic value. The Warboss, a massive greenskin that the Mechanicus estimated at over 3 meters tall, redirected his forces toward different objectives rather than engaging us directly. We killed hundreds of his subordinates, left them displayed in ways that the Munitorum would prefer I didn't describe in detail, and the response wasn't the overwhelming retaliation you'd expect from Orks but rather a kind of strategic withdrawal, a recognition that some territory wasn't worth the cost of holding. I started asking questions after Catachan. Not to my squad, they wouldn't have answered, or would have answered in ways that just created more questions, but to the regimental medicae, the tech priests attached to our unit, anyone who might have documentation on what Catachan's environment actually did to human physiology over generations. The answers I got were incomplete, hedged with classification restrictions and Mechanicus cant, but the outline was clear enough. Catachan wasn't just a death world. It was a world that reshaped human biology through continuous environmental pressure, selecting for traits that would be considered mutations anywhere else, but that the Imperium quietly tolerated because the end result was useful, more than useful, essential. The death world environment produced a form of directed evolution, accelerated adaptation that worked on timescales of individual lifetimes rather than millennia. The chemical secretions, the enhanced sensory capabilities, the neurological modifications that produced what I'd been thinking of as predatory instincts, these weren't side effects. They were the intended outcome, the natural result of a human population that had survived for thousands of years on a world where everything was trying to kill them, and the only successful strategy was to become more lethal than anything else in the ecosystem. The Imperium knew. Of course they knew. The Departamento Munitorum had documentation going back centuries on Catachan psychology and physiology, carefully maintained records that tracked how many generations it took for new arrivals to the planet to develop the characteristic traits, how those traits express differently based on which region of Catachan you survived childhood in, what percentage of the population developed the fullest expression of the adaptive complex, versus what percentage were simply unusually tough baseline humans. They knew, and they recruited from Catachans specifically because of what the world produced, not in spite of it. I found a reference, buried in a tactical assessment written 50 years ago by an Ordo Xenos inquisitor who'd observed Catachan operations on a half-dozen worlds, that described our regiment's effect on enemy morale as comparable to the deployment of Space Marine scout companies, with the notable exception that Catachan forces produce adverse psychological effects through mechanisms that appear to bypass conscious threat assessment and operate at a pre-rational evolutionary level. The Inquisitor recommended further study, but noted that, given the Departamento Munitorum's documented reluctance to examine the specific nature of Catachan effectiveness, and the evident utility of maintaining regiment morale through incomplete disclosure, such study is unlikely to receive official sanction. I was 28 years old when I read that. I'd been serving off-world for 10 years, had participated in 8 major campaigns, and dozens of minor operations, had killed more orcs than I could count, and probably an equal number of other Xeno species and heretics. I'd received 3 commendations for valor, 2 for tactical innovation, and 1 for what the citation described as exemplary leadership under conditions of extreme adversity. I'd made sergeant, then lieutenant, was being discussed for captain, and I was only just beginning to understand what I'd become, what Catachan had made me into before I was old enough to consent to the transformation. The next deployment was back to jungle warfare, a world called Mordant's Edge in the Segmentum Tempestus, where an Ork Warg had taken root in the equatorial forests. The Lord General specifically requested Catachan regiments, said the terrain was perfect for our capabilities, and we went eagerly, because jungle warfare felt like returning to our proper element after the Dissonance Forge World operations. The transport ship barely had time to deploy us before we disappeared into the undergrowth, and within hours it was like we'd been there for weeks, the jungle accepting us in a way that it resisted the Orks' attempts at conquest. This was where I started to understand the title of this confession, The Thing I'm Trying to Make You Comprehend, before they give me another promotion and send me back to train recruits who don't yet know what they're volunteering to become. The Orks on Mordant's Edge were from a particularly aggressive tribe, what the Munitorum classified as Blood Axe Clan based on their tactical sophistication, which for Orks meant they occasionally used something resembling strategy rather than simply charging at the nearest enemy. They'd been there for over a year, had carved out substantial territory, and intelligence suggested the Warboss was coordinating multiple mobs in a way that showed genuine military thinking. This should have been a hard fight, the kind of campaign that ground down regiments over months of attritional warfare. Instead, the Orks started pulling back within 3 weeks of our deployment. Not from Imperial forces in general, they still engaged Mordian Iron Guard positions, still pushed toward mining colonies and agricultural settlements. But from the sectors where Catachan regiments were operating, they withdrew. They abandoned defensive positions that had strategic value. They redirected supply convoys to avoid routes we were patrolling, and when they absolutely had to enter territory we controlled, they did it fast, moving through as quickly as possible rather than stopping to fight the way Orks normally would. I started noticing the patterns in how we operated, things I'd done my entire military career but had never examined consciously. The way we marked territory wasn't just about tactical markers or Vox beacon placement. We were leaving scent traces, chemical signatures that I couldn't perceive directly but that I knew were there because of how my body responded when we entered areas other Catachan squads had claimed. We were establishing dominance hierarchies within the regiment that had nothing to do with official rank and everything to do with who could produce the strongest chemical signatures, who showed the most complete adaptation to the predatory paradigm, and we were doing it all unconsciously. Our bodies and neurological systems operating according to protocols that had been installed generations before we were born. The jungle itself responded to us differently than it responded to other humans. The local wildlife, which should have been as much a threat to us as to the orcs, gave us space. Predator species that attacked other guard regiments on sight would watch us pass and choose not to engage. Some level of their nervous system identifying us as something that wasn't prey, wasn't competition, but was something else entirely. Something that didn't fit into the normal categories of threat assessment. We were moving through the Mordant's edge ecosystem like we belonged there, like we were a native species that had always been part of the environmental balance, and the jungle was treating us accordingly. The orcs noticed. Of course they noticed. They might be brutal and crude, but they're not stupid, not in the way humans want to believe they are. Their entire species is built around combat, has been refined through millions of years of warfare into perfect fighting machines, and that means they have threat assessment capabilities that are probably more sophisticated than ours in some ways. They can identify danger instinctively, can recognize when something is more lethal than they are, even if they usually choose to fight it anyway, because combat is their biological imperative. But with Catachans, they were choosing not to fight, not because they were afraid in any way that humans understand fear, but because at some level their biology was telling them that engaging us wasn't combat, wasn't the good scrap they were looking for. It was something else, something that triggered responses in their nervous system that were older than their species' love of warfare, that connected to survival instincts that predated their genetic engineering by whatever ancient civilization had created them. I talked to an orc once. After Mordant's Edge, we'd captured a handful of greenskins for interrogation, standard practice, and I was translating because I'd picked up enough of their language over the years to communicate at a basic level. The orc was a big one, a knob who'd survived multiple campaigns, and he should have been defiant, aggressive, looking for any opportunity to escape and fight. Instead, he kept watching us with this expression that I initially read as calculation but eventually understood was something closer to unease. I asked him, through the broken Gothic and Orcish hybrid language that served for communication, why his warboss had avoided direct engagement with Catachan forces, why they'd withdrawn from sectors we controlled instead of fighting for them the way orcs normally would. The orc was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, in Orcish that was simpler than I expected, like he was searching for words to describe something he didn't have proper vocabulary for. "You smell wrong. Not like humies. Not like anything else. Smell like." And here he used a word that I had to piece together from context, but the closest translation would be something like jungle that thinks or forest that hunts. A predatory environment given consciousness and purpose. He continued, "Boss says we fight for good scrap. We fight humies, they die good. We fight space marines, they die hard, but we get best fight. We fight elder, they run fast, but we catch 'em. But you," he paused, made a gesture with his bound hands that seemed to indicate the entirety of our presence. "You not fight like humies fight. You fight like world fights. Like planet trying to kill us. Boss says, best loot, not worth fighting planet that thinks, says, we find other humies, get good scrap there, let you have this place, because only thing that beats you is more of you, and we not here for that kind of fight." I reported this to command, expected them to dismiss it as Xeno superstition or misunderstanding. Instead, the colonel looked at me with that same clinical expression the Ordo Xenos attaché had worn years ago and said, "That's classified information, Lieutenant. The nature of Catachan adaptations and their tactical applications is not material for general distribution. You're to forget this conversation and ensure your men understand that speculation on regiment capabilities is counter to unit cohesion and operational security," which told me everything I needed to know. The Imperium knew exactly what Catachans were, what we'd become, through generations of survival, on a death world that reshaped human biology into something that could match its lethality. They knew. They encouraged it. They recruited us specifically because of it. And they very carefully didn't talk about it in any context that might reach civilian populations or other guard regiments, or anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about where the line was between human and crace and, quote, something else wearing human shape. After Mordant's Edge, I requested transfer to the Administratum. It took 3 applications and a personal interview with a commissar who seemed more curious than suspicious about why a decorated combat officer wanted to push paperwork in a climate-controlled archive. I told him I'd served my time in the field, wanted to contribute to the war effort in a support capacity, needed a break from frontline deployment, all of which was true, as far as it went. What I didn't tell him was that I couldn't stand to be around my squad anymore. That the chemical signatures we were all producing were triggering responses in my neurology that I didn't want to examine too closely. That I was starting to dream about Catachan, even though I hadn't been back to my homeworld in 12 years. Dreams where the jungle was calling me home, telling me that I'd learned enough from the wider Imperium and it was time to return to where I belonged, to breed and raise children who would inherit the adaptations I'd developed and pass them on to the next generation of jungle fighters. That the thought of going back to Catachan terrified me, because I knew that if I went, I would never leave, would become completely absorbed into whatever the planet was turning us into, would lose the last remnants of the baseline human I'd been before the Death World's environment started rewriting my biology. I've been in the Administratum archives for 2 years now. I work with logistics, data, deployment schedules, casualty reports. I live in hab blocks that smell of recycled air and synthetic materials, eat processed food that tastes like nothing, interact with baseline humans who don't produce the chemical signatures my body is constantly searching for. It's a kind of slow suffocation, a daily exercise in denying what Catachan made me, but it's preferable to the alternative. Sometimes I see other Catachans in the archive sections, veterans who've made the same choice I have, who've requested transfers away from frontline deployment for reasons they don't articulate. We don't talk to each other much. Don't need to. We can smell what we are, what we've become, and that's enough. There's a mutual understanding that we're here because we looked at what the Imperium was using us for, what we'd been shaped to be, and decided we wanted at least a few years of pretending to be baseline human before the Death World's modifications became too pronounced to hide. I still get the reports from frontline Catachan deployments. Still read the after-action summaries, the casualty figures, the tactical assessments, and I pay attention to the patterns in how enemy forces respond to Catachan operations, particularly Ork responses, because that's where the truth is most obvious. Ork Warbosses avoid prolonged engagement with Catachan regiments. They will fight other guard regiments to the last greenskin. They will charge Space Marine positions and throw themselves at Titans and ram starships into Imperial Navy vessels, because combat is their species' fundamental purpose. But with Catachans, they choose alternative objectives. They withdraw from sectors we control. They specifically request reinforcements before entering territory we've claimed. And even then, they move through quickly rather than stopping to fight the way they normally would. The official explanation, the one you'll find in Munitorum tactical manuals, is that Catachans are simply that effective at jungle warfare, that we inflict such disproportionate casualties that even Orks recognize the tactical disadvantage, that our reputation precedes us, that enemy forces have learned through experience that fighting Catachans in our preferred terrain is a losing proposition. That's all true, as far as it goes. But it's not the real answer, not the complete one. The real answer is that Orks can smell what we are, what Catachan has made us into. Their biology recognizes our biology at a level that has nothing to do with conscious thought or tactical assessment. We smell like apex predators, like the top of a food chain that humans aren't supposed to occupy. like something that's supposed to be impossible but exists anyway because the Imperium needed it to exist, and Catachan was willing to produce it over generations of environmental pressure that would have killed weaker populations. We smell like death worlds that think, like ecosystems that have developed consciousness and purpose. We smell like the jungle given human shape, like the undergrowth made mobile and tactical, like everything that's trying to kill you on a planet that doesn't want you to survive, but condensed into a human nervous system and given knives and lasguns and the ability to plan ambushes. And orcs, who will fight anything else in the galaxy without hesitation, recognize that smell and make the same decision that any predator makes when it encounters something higher on the food chain. They choose to hunt somewhere else, where the prey doesn't smell like planet as predator, where combat is what they expect it to be, rather than something that triggers evolutionary warnings their species developed long before the Imperium existed. The Departamento Munitorum knows this. The Commissariat knows this. The Ordo Xenos knows this. They know exactly what Catachan produces and why it's effective, and they very carefully maintain the useful fiction that we're just exceptionally well-trained jungle fighters, rather than something that's arguably not quite human anymore, that's been shaped by generations of environmental pressure into a form that can survive on death worlds by becoming more lethal than the death world itself. They know, and they recruit us anyway, because the Imperium needs soldiers who can operate in environments that break normal humans, who can match Xenos species that baseline humanity can't compete with. They need what Catachan produces, even if what it produces would probably be classified as abhuman if anyone examined it too closely, even if it raises uncomfortable questions about where the line is between adaptive evolution and mutation, between tactical advantage and something that the ecclesiarchy might have opinions about. I requested this transfer because I wanted to understand what I'd become before I became completely unable to be anything else. I wanted a few years where I could try to be human in the way the Administratum understands humanity, where I could interact with baseline people and pretend that the modifications Catachan installed in my biology were reversible, were something I could step away from if I chose to. They're not reversible. I know that now. The chemical secretions, the enhanced senses, the predatory subroutines that live in the ancient parts of my brain, these aren't side effects or training artifacts. They're permanent biological modifications that were installed in my ancestors thousands of years ago and have been refined through generations of selection pressure until they're as much a part of being Catachan as height or eye, color or blood type. In another year, I'll request transfer back to frontline deployment. Not because I want to, but because the alternative is staying in the Administratum archives until my biology gives up from lack of proper environmental stimulus, until the adaptations that keep me alive in death world conditions start working against me in a climate-controlled habitat, until I die of some condition that the Medicae will diagnose as organ failure or systemic collapse, but that I'll know is really just the jungle claiming me back, punishing me for trying to be something I'm not anymore. When I return to combat deployment, I'll be assigned to train new recruits, to help them understand what it means to be Catachan, to survive on a death world, and then take that survival capacity to other planets, where the Imperium needs soldiers who can operate in environments that break normal humans, and I'll teach them the skills they need, the knife work and the jungle craft, and the tactical principles that make Catachan regiments the finest jungle fighters in the Imperium. But I won't tell them what I'm telling you now. I won't explain that the skills are secondary to the biological modifications, that the training is really just learning to consciously control adaptations that their bodies are already developing on their own, that every year they spend off-world, they're becoming something that's further from baseline human and closer to what the jungle needs them to be, to survive. I won't tell them because the Imperium doesn't want them to know, and because knowing doesn't change anything anyway. We're what Catachan made us. We serve the Emperor by being the soldiers he needs us to be. And if that means becoming something that makes orcs choose to hunt somewhere else, something that smells like Death World, as consciousness to species that can perceive such things, then that's what we'll be. The Imperium has bred warriors before. Space Marines, created through surgical modification and genetic enhancement to be superior to baseline humans in every measurable way. Tempestus Scions, trained from childhood to be the most elite special forces in the Guard. Krieg Death Corps, shaped by generations of cultural conditioning to value death in the Emperor's service above life itself. But Catachans are different. We weren't designed by gene rights or modified by mechanicus surgery or culturally conditioned through propaganda. We were shaped by a planet that was trying to kill us, by thousands of years of environmental pressure that selected for traits that could match a death world's lethality. We're what evolution produces when it's compressed into accelerated timescales and given a specific selection pressure. Survive or die, adapt or be consumed. And the result is soldiers who are so effective at jungle warfare that Orks, the most combat-obsessed species in the galaxy, choose to avoid prolonged engagement with us. Not because we're better fighters, though we are. Not because we inflict higher casualties, though we do. But because at some fundamental level their biology recognizes our biology and sends evolutionary warnings that say, this is not prey, this is not combat, this is predator that shouldn't exist, hunt somewhere else. That's why Ork Warbosses avoid open war with Catachan jungle fighters. That's the answer you won't find in tactical manuals or after-action reports or official Munitorum doctrine. And that's why I'm telling you this now, before they promote me again and send me back to the jungle where I belong, where the smell is right, and my body stops suffocating in climate-controlled air, and I can finally stop pretending to be something I'm not anymore. The Emperor protects, the Imperium endures, and Catachan produces exactly the soldiers it was designed to produce, whether anyone wants to acknowledge what that means or not. I've made my peace with it. Soon I'll stop fighting it entirely. And when I do, when I return to frontline deployment and let the adaptations run their full course without resistance, I'll be exactly what the Imperium needs me to be. A piece of death world given purpose. A fragment of jungle that learned to walk upright and hold weapons and serve the Emperor by being too lethal for even Orks to want to fight. That's the truth. That's what's really happening on worlds where Catachan regiments deploy and enemy forces suddenly decide they have business elsewhere. We're not just winning through tactics or training or superior fieldcraft. We're winning because we've become something that triggers prey responses in species that aren't supposed to be prey, that makes predators choose to hunt somewhere else because we smell like the apex of food chains that humans were never meant to occupy. The Imperium knows, they've always known, and they recruit us anyway, deploy us anyway, use us anyway, because in the grim darkness of the far future, there's no room for squeamishness about what forms human survival takes. There's only what works and what doesn't, what wins battles and what loses them, what keeps the Imperium's enemies at bay and what lets them advance. Catachans work. We win battles. We keep the enemies at bay. And if the cost is becoming something that's arguably not quite human anymore, something that makes Orks uncomfortable and triggers evolutionary warnings in Xenos species that shouldn't be able to recognize threats the way we represent threats, then that's a cost the Imperium is willing to pay. I'm willing to pay it too. Not because I want to, but because I don't have a choice anymore. Catachan made this choice for me before I was born, installed it in my genetics and neurology and endocrine system, and now I get to live with the consequences while pretending it was always my decision to serve, my choice to become what the Emperor needs. In the end, that's all any of us are in the Imperium. Tools shaped for specific purposes, biological machines designed to fill tactical niches, human resources allocated according to strategic necessity. The only difference with Catachans is that we were shaped by our homeworld instead of by conscious design, evolved instead of engineered, but the result is the same. We're what the Imperium needs us to be, and what we need or want or choose for ourselves is irrelevant, measured against that requirement. So yes, Ork Warbosses avoid open war with Catachan jungle fighters. They smell what we are. Their biology recognizes our biology, and they make the calculation that any predator makes when encountering something higher on the food chain. They hunt somewhere else. They choose other objectives. They avoid prolonged engagement, not from fear but from the same evolutionary wisdom that keeps smaller predators away from larger ones, that makes prey species flee from apex hunters, that maintains ecological balance through recognition of relative lethality. We're the apex hunters. We're what death worlds produce when they've had thousands of years to shape human biology into something that can match their environment's lethality. We're the jungle given consciousness and weapons and purpose, compressed into human form and deployed across the Imperium wherever the Emperor needs soldiers who can operate in conditions that kill normal humans. And the Orks can smell it, can recognize it at a level that bypasses their love of combat and connects to something older, something that predates their species' genetic programming, can understand, without words or conscious thought, that fighting Catachans isn't the good scrap they're looking for but something else entirely, something that their biology tells them to avoid the same way it tells them to breathe and eat and seek out worthy opponents. That's the truth. That's what I've learned over 15 years of service, 8 major campaigns, dozens of operations, and more kills than I can count. That's what the Imperium knows and carefully doesn't acknowledge, what the Departamento Munitorum documents but buries in classified files, what every experienced Catachan understands but doesn't articulate, because articulating it means confronting what we've become and what we can never stop being. I've confronted it now. I've looked at what Catachan made me, what the death world installed in my biology, what 15 years of off-world deployment has refined and enhanced and made permanent. I've examined it clearly enough to understand that there's no going back, no returning to whatever baseline humanity I might have been if I'd been born somewhere else, somewhere that didn't require its population to evolve or die. And in 1 year, maybe less, I'll stop resisting it. I'll request transfer back to combat deployment, return to the jungle where I belong, and let the adaptations run their full course without the suffocating resistance of trying to pretend I'm something I'm not. I'll become fully what Catachan designed me to be, what the Imperium needs me to be, what the Emperor requires for humanity's survival in a galaxy that wants us dead. I'll become the reason Ork Warbosses avoid open war with Catachan jungle fighters, the thing they smell that triggers warnings in their biology, the death world as consciousness, the jungle that hunts, the apex predator that humans were never meant to be but that we became anyway because survival required it. And I'll serve. And I'll kill. And I'll do it with the efficiency that Catachan bred into me over generations of environmental pressure. And I'll try not to think too much about what that makes me, what I've become, what I can never stop being now that the adaptations have taken root. The Emperor protects. The Imperium endures. And Catachan produces exactly the soldiers it was designed to produce. That's all that matters. That's all that's ever mattered. Everything else is just biological detail, evolutionary mechanics. The specific mechanisms through which survival happens in a galaxy that has no mercy for weakness or hesitation or insufficient lethality. I've made my peace with it. Soon I'll embrace it entirely. And when I do, I'll finally stop suffocating in climate-controlled air, stop denying what my body knows it needs, stop pretending that baseline humanity is something I can still claim as my identity. I'll return to the jungle. I'll become what I was always going to become, and somewhere in the undergrowth of a death world or combat zone, some Ork Warboss will smell what I am and make the decision to hunt somewhere else, and the Imperium will call it a victory and never acknowledge what form that victory takes or what it cost to produce soldiers who can achieve it. That's the truth. That's the answer to why Ork Warbosses avoid open war with Catachan jungle fighters. And that's why I'm in the Administratum archives instead of where I belong, buying myself a few more years of denying what Catachan made me before the denial becomes impossible, and I have to accept what I've been since before I was born. A tool shaped by environmental pressure to match the Imperium's needs, a fragment of death world given human form and purpose, a predator that shouldn't exist, but does, because survival required it. The Emperor protects, and sometimes what he protects us with isn't quite human anymore. But it works. And in the end, that's all that matters in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, and the soldiers who fight it, and the terrible pragmatism of what forms those soldiers must take to keep humanity alive for one more day.